I want to welcome Mr. Art Thibert to Thinking Critical for the first time. I've just met you, about 30 minutes ago? Feels like we're already old pals.
Yeah, we had a good conversation. We got caught up. We know each other's backstory, so it's all good, man.
And you have had a very interesting career within comic books. You're almost like the evolution of comic books itself. You come in at the right time, and you're part of the extreme movement in the 90s. And your last major work within the big two was, I think, Super Sons, a book that I think a lot of people love. And then you realized that indie comic books were probably the way to go, that maybe crowdfunding was another avenue, and YouTube might be a way to reach out to people. And you've basically evolved along with comic books. You haven't stayed in a stasis environment. You've evolved, adapted.
Yeah. I think you have to adapt or you die, right? So one of the things I always thought, I'm primarily known as an inker, but I've penciled all my career, is adaptation. Like, you have to adapt. I would see people that would have one style of working, and then maybe they even are really, really popular with that one style, but then it goes for a couple years and then they kind of fade out. And then they're so connected to that one style that they can't really do much of anything else. So I never wanted to be too beholden to one particular thing. So also, I get bored pretty quickly. So I think, mixing it up and trying different things all the time is good for the soul. So that's why I've always done stuff like that.
That's definitely one of the things that you'll notice if you go out and look at artwork, and I imagine a lot of people have, is in your career as a penciler, and you've certainly been a penciler for a long time, your pencils adapt over time to almost who you're inking at the time.
Yeah, I think it's like just an evolution, and probably 10 years from now, nothing will look the same. Even though some people say I can still see, like I can tell your artwork over time, but I do think it's changed. And when people say it's changed, I try to take that as a compliment, because sometimes people say it's changed, but that's like a nice way of saying I don't like it, So I try to take it as a compliment. Yeah.
It's weird how comic books have evolved. Like the comic book creative team has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking over time, mostly kind of led by Marvel and DC. Back in the day, you would have your writer, you'd have a penciler, an inker, a letterer, a colorist, and a lot of these things become digital. And I do miss inkers, but I almost miss letterers almost even more. There's like no character to the lettering in comic books anymore.
Yeah, anybody can do it. Yeah, if you have the files and stuff like that, you can do it. I mean, in the early days, like the letterer was creating their own fonts. You know what I mean? So it still felt personal. But now you can just purchase them, and so it's very homogenized. And basically, letterers killed their own art form, I believe. And Richard Starking's a friend of mine, and but man, either he saw the writing on the wall and was going to cash in early, or he just didn't care, because I don't know if you know Richard, but he created those fonts and stuff like that, and then he started selling them, to just anybody that could pay, for the stuff. So I think he really flooded the market with his font. So it's probably all kind of the DNA stems from his early work. But he was selling the fonts. And so, yeah, anybody that can type in and do basic composition with the balloons can be a letterer now. So, yeah.
I was like there used to be letters, like the first letter was always bigger than the other letters. They would do like little things to kind of, mark that is lettered by this particular person. And
because it was hand done. It was hand done. You can't help it. So like if you're angry or a little more aggressive that day, your lettering is going to be a little bit more, bold, and if you're a little timid, then it'll probably your emotions will reflect in your work. I know it does mine. But the one thing I don't miss is letterers would work on the boards after the penciler. So in the early days, so what they would do is they would letter right on the artboard. So it wasn't digital. So they would letter right on the board. So what they would do is they would just, because it was production, they would just draw lines all the way through, and then they would put the lettering, because the lines would be a guide, and then they put the letters in there. But they would just kind of draw lines all over the pencil stuff, and they would draw those lines in pencil, right? So if there was like a skyscraper or there was like a cityscape behind the balloons, all of a sudden you have lettering lines and you have the drawn lines by the penciler there. So as an inker, you have to try to figure out what are the guidelines for the letter and what are the inkable lines for the buildings in
where
the
the
background.
pencils end and the letters begin.
Yeah. There was kind of like this stuff just going on, and you had to kind of work a little bit to decipher between the two. So it was a little tough.
Now, you are an award-winning inker. You were the 2-time Wizard Fan Award for Favorite Inker. You were a Props Award for Inker deserving more recognition by Inkwell Awards, as well as nominated for Eisner Awards for Best Inker for your work on Uncanny X-Men. And I think that's where a lot of people recognize the name Art Thibert, at least initially, was all that work on those 90s X-Men. It was awesome.
Yeah. I worked on Superman 2 all the way up to the death of. So I think about 3 years logged in the Superman office. So we did all the way up to the death of, Doomsday's, So
you're inking Dan Jurgens?
Yeah, I was doing finishes on Dan Jurgens in the day, and I was penciling and inking the Action Comics covers for about a year, and that's while I was doing the X books. So I kind of had one foot in the X office and one foot in the Superman office, and I do remember that I was there, I was present for all the death of, but I wasn't quite in the loop because I wasn't there full time, so I didn't have the full even though I got character designs, but Mike Carlin, who was the editor, only gave me the stuff I needed to do the cover. So I knew this character Doomsday was important, but I didn't know how important, you know what I mean? Like until later. And so if you remember, the way they introduced Doomsday is he had the shroud on. So he had all these tattered clothes, and they kept kind of getting ripped off as it went. So, I was doing a series of covers. So as the covers were going, you see more and more of Doomsday. And so I get the reference and go, oh man, there's a pretty cool design underneath that stuff. So and then there was the wedding album, and all that stuff that we did, and then the 90s X-Men stuff with Jim Lee and Whilce Portacio and Chris Claremont and John Byrne.
Better than that.
God, all that stuff. Yeah,
you're like literally sitting there surrounded by greatness, and you have to elevate yourself up to it, right?
Oh, always bring your A game. Yeah. You're only as good as your last job.
Yeah. So what's it like when you're inking over, Jim Lee, perhaps the most influential artist of his time? We're talking about John Byrne, maybe the most influential artist of his time, the generation before that. Chris Claremont, the writer, the most successful writer on a comic series of all time. What was that, a 16, 17-year run?
Yeah. And I think I probably had like 15 years logged into the X office on and off. But John Byrne, I think, was he was doing a lot of the writing when we were working on the X book. So I never got to ink John Byrne. So that's still a bucket list thing. I would love to do that. But the thing is, like with Jim, like I knew Jim, like the first year we did San Diego, like our first year basically in the industry, I met Jim at San Diego. We were sitting next to each other at the table, and we hung out for the full 3 or 4 days and just got along real well. And he was doing Alpha Flight, and I was doing I was penciling some Teen Titans Spotlight stuff, and so just got along real well. And then he went his direction, I think Punisher and stuff, and I went into Superman direction. And then I just got a call from Bob Harris, and he said, I want you to start working on some X books. So I went, I did an annual, with Terry Schumacher, and then inking Art Adams. That was crazy, right? Just like start inking Art Adams. And then, Walter Simonson on FF, Fantastic Four. And then got the call to do some fill and stuff on Uncanny with Jim Lee. And so you asked, like, what was Jim Lee? It's Jim Lee. Jim Lee wasn't Jim Lee then. Like Jim Lee was just a guy. You know what I mean? He was just a very talented, artist. So it was always a pleasure and a privilege to work with somebody that talented. But he definitely wasn't elevated to, like comic book god then,
No, he hadn't sold 6 million copies of one book on his name.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty crazy. So you mentioned some personalities there. A lot of people, for some reason, John Byrne, I've never met the guy, but he has a reputation for being a little bit surly and not fun to work with. Did you ever have any issues with him?
No, like I said, he came in and wrote on some of those X books. So I usually didn't get the scripts, or I wasn't on that side, the storytelling side of the books. So I did inks and finishes, which was way more than, that was a lot of work unto itself. So I always wanted to work with the guy. One quick John Byrne story is I was in the office, Mike Carlin at DC Comics, and his Rolodex. This is the day of Rolodexes, and I wanted so badly to work with John, so I went through Mike's Rolodex and got John Byrne's phone number.
Very nice.
Yeah, I never called him though. I felt it felt dirty. I felt wrong.
I would have tried it anyway, but you got to risk it for the biscuit, right?
Come on, man. Yeah, do it. Yeah.
John freaking Byrne. Although he did have the reputation, that he might just tell you to go F yourself.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking unsolicited, it would probably sum up that I would never work with him, kind of thing. So
you brought up somebody else that I don't think gets the credit they deserve. I mean, obviously everyone knows Dan Jurgens did the Death of Superman and been a fantastic creator for so long, but it doesn't feel like he should be done yet, but he's not really getting a lot of work these days. He just seems like a fantastic creator that really gets the characters, especially Superman. Why isn't that guy or somebody in the mold of Dan Jurgens, preferably him himself, why aren't they like the group editors of like Superman at this point? That used to be the normal career progression, wasn't it?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, Pete Tomasi is one of those guys that gets those DC characters too. Like why isn't he writing every book there, as well? But I think like Jurgens, artistically speaking, like as a writer, he's brilliant, but I think almost everything he's done writing wise, he's drawn. And I think Jurgens, and I've talked to him about this, Jurgens is really only as good as the inker he's working with. So like Jurgens, he pencils, and this is not a slight, he pencils exactly the same way he did 40 years ago, 35 years ago on Adventures of Superman. So he pretty much does breakdowns, and the pencils really haven't changed. But if you notice, like the stuff that's a little bit more successful than others artistically, it's because of the inker. It's the inker bringing something, like an additive to the mix. And the thing is, he knows that. Like Dan likes that. He likes the idea that he can kind of just create a building block, which is the storytelling, the gestures and all that stuff. And then somebody can come in and do the finishes on it and polish it. So like if he wanted to do a sci-fi book, he could find a really good sci-fi inker or finisher to come in, or if he wanted to do something scarier or whatever. So he could find somebody that could kind of like, I don't know, set the tone for the story. And I always thought that was a pretty smart idea because he's, like we were talking about, like a chameleon, like early on with the inks, he can kind of like, based on the talent, he can look completely different. Like when Kevin Nolan was inking him on that Superman, Alien stuff? Holy crap, man, that stuff was amazing looking. And people tell me that my time with them was pretty, it was pretty unique. It had its own look. But to kind of answer one of the things you were talking about earlier on, I don't think there's a lot of inkers with strong voices right now to do that. So maybe that's part of, Dan Jurgens kind of, like the wow factor just isn't there because there isn't the talent to support it, Yeah,
it's crazy. Inkers used to be an enormously integral part of the creative team. And, inkers do a lot of stuff. They're able to take the original vision and add that a little extra flavor, a little spice to it, but you're also able to add depth to the story, with your line weights and all that stuff. And with a lot of these people that are just doing it on iPads or whatever, like you can't even tell what's the background and the foreground anymore because they don't even understand the idea of line weight.
Yeah, and line weights are essential because they distinguish it. They prioritize how you see something. So, usually the thicker line is in the foreground, the middle weight line is in the midground, and then the thinnest is in the background. So you're prioritizing planes and you're making it easier for people to see the image and to understand the image. But if all the line weights are the same, then it becomes kind of hard to decipher these things. And another thing, when you're working with these digital programs and stuff like that, they can emulate to a certain extent, but there's a lot of cheats. There's a tool, like it stabilizes the line, so if you put it down and it's a little shaky, it'll stabilize it. There's a lot of cheats that are built into the inking programs. And also the thing is, like, if everybody's using the same inking program, then essentially if you don't really try hard to break out of that, that program limits, then everything's going to look the same. You know what I mean? You're going to have a homogenized look.
There's no character.
There's no character. There's no personality to it. So I think if you're going to use the program, you really have to understand the limitations of the program. You can do great things with those programs, but you really have to understand them.
Yeah, we don't even really talk about many inkers nowadays, other than maybe like a Klaus Janson. Maybe
but even
Eber
that
Ferreira.
guy.
But
those guys predate me. Those guys were doing stuff before. Klaus was. But the thing is, I think what happened is that you mentioned there were three talents in the books. There were writer, penciler, inker, and they were considered talent in the day up till digital coloring. And so then, like, coloring and lettering was considered production. So they weren't considered talent on the book. That's why usually, like, when credits went on the covers, they didn't get cover credit because they were considered production. And so then what happened is digital coloring started becoming more and more having a voice in comics and dictating.
Because of Wildstorm.
Yeah, Wildstorm helped. And even there was a lot of guys pioneering this. There was Ole Optics, Steve Olaf. Or Olaf, that was doing the Spawn books. That was some early digital stuff. And so what happened is instead of Marvel and DC going, okay, we'll honor this inker's rate and we'll establish a coloring rate, they went, why don't we just kind of combine these two talents, right? So inking and inking and coloring became kind of, as the companies were seeing it, as the same thing. You know what I mean? So like an inker would get less per page because then they would give that extra to the colorist. And then even royalties and things, they started kind of basically whatever the inker's cut was, they were kind of sharing it, over into the coloring. And then I've even lost jobs at Marvel because budgetarily they couldn't afford an awesome colorist and an awesome inker. You know what I mean? So they could have one or the other.
The book has to cost a certain amount of money, with the expectation of what they're going to sell and how much the writer costs to actually be profitable at some point. But I'll be honest, with the modern coloring, I wish they would go back to the markers. Because you used to distinguish the character and they would pop out of the background and everything. It feels like, within a lot of modern coloring, because they do so much blending, it's all just like tones of green and brown in the background. And it's just, nothing pops, nothing's exciting, nothing's vibrant anymore.
Yeah. I think that there was, because there was a very limited palette, what they could do production-wise with coloring, that they had to really do more with less, right? So they were more concerned with storytelling, popping the characters, establishing planes, things like that. And now, like, because they can be more realistic with the coloring, some of that stuff has been lost because everything becomes full focus. You know, everything becomes perfectly colored instead of like simplifying stuff in the background or doing more of a muted color palette for the background. Everything competes. You know, the background competes with foreground and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's made it a less enjoyable experience as far as the excitement levels. But, you know, you got to work with the X-Men in the 90s. And a lot of people, you know, we got this X-Men reboot coming up and they don't want to go back to the mansion. We can't go back to the 90s. And, hey, I'll be the first to admit, maybe we don't want to go back to 90s era Superman so much. There's some good stuff in there, but some of it wasn't great. You know, maybe not to a character here and there, maybe not 90s Spider-Man. But if there's one set of characters from the 90s you want to go back to, it's freaking X-Men. It was awesome the entire decade.
Yeah, yeah. You know, like I think a key to the X-Men was the art teams. Like one thing that they always did is if they brought in a new art, well, one, Bob Harris would always find the hot team, right? You'd always find the hot team. He'd woo them into the office, and then he would let them basically dictate what the X-Men would look like, right? So if Joe Mad came in, the costumes changed. You know, if Jim Lee came in, costumes changed. You know, like whoever, you know, Larry Stroman, you know, like whoever was the art team got to like change them. So everything was unique. Everything was kind of ongoing. So everything felt fresh. I mean, there was legacy, but you know, these characters weren't beholden to like one thing or always like one team either. They always mix and match the team. So you got to see different dynamics, different characters interact, things like that. So it was always interesting visually. Those books were always cutting edge visually. I can't speak, you know, highly about the stories all the time. I mean, there were some great stories, but artistically, those things were the best of what the industry had to offer at that moment in time, I believe.
Absolutely. And it felt like they really got the events right. You know, they really led up the stuff, and it was always cool when you get the event that went over 3 different X-Men books for 3 continuous issues. So it's 9 issues in long or whatever. And it's like the perfect length for a really cool story. You invest in on all 3 of the titles, and you grow the reading audience on all of them. But at that point, I think everybody was just reading all the X-Men books.
Well, you had new characters constantly coming in. You had Bishop, you had Cable, you had Deadpool. Like there was stuff happening. There were villains that were being created all the time. You know, so there was always a sense that things were happening there. I just think like the industry now, I don't think that there's a way to get that talent and inspire them to do these things anymore, because there just isn't the money and the prestige there to woo them, right? If you're really, really talented, to be quite honest, you're probably working in Hollywood. You're doing design work, you're doing storyboards, you're doing those things. You're probably not doing comic books. Or if you do, you're doing them part-time.
On the side, as a hobby or something like a passion project.
Passion, yeah.
So was there somebody's design of an X-Men character? You know, because you work with a lot of different great artists. Obviously, just the lineup of X-Men is awesome. Is there a particular design on a character that was your favorite to ink?
Well, Wolverine was always a blast. You know, Wolverine was always a blast. Inking any of Jim Lee's women was fantastic. There was this big splash panel of Psylocke coming out of like this creek or lake or whatever. And I still remember getting the breakdowns for that from Jim, and I'm like, this is cool. And I do have to say, those hips on Psylocke, those are mine, because Jim trusted me enough. He's like, yeah, she's a little hippie, Art. You bring those things down a little bit. So as hippie as she still ended up being in the final, she got a little weight loss, you know, in the inks. Yeah.
So the first time you met Jim Lee, you said you were at a con. Could you just tell immediately it's like, this is something that's going to blow people's minds? Like this is going to be a real thing in comic books that people aren't going to be able to deny?
No, I think he was good. He was
pretty good.
You know, he was working on Alpha Flight, so he was good. But it wasn't like, oh my gosh, this guy's so good, I got to hitch my wagon to him. You know,
it's not like
I
Todd
just
McFarlane on Hulk, where you just like, I've never really seen anything quite like that.
never seen anything like this. No, I mean, it was really good. You know, and I think Jim liked, I'm going to just say, like, being corrupted, because when I did the conventions, I'm not a big drinker, so I don't want to make it seem like an alcoholic, but I had a cooler underneath the table, so I was always pretty generous with the libations. And so I remember passing them over to Jim under the table, and I had my little styrofoam, because, you know, if you cracked open an aluminum can like a beer, you know, you'd probably be asked to leave. So we'd pour them under the table, and we were kind of, you know, having a good time, having a few beers, you know, hanging out with people and stuff.
Jim's supposed to be the responsible one. He's the family man of the Image 7.
Nah, he always was, but he also liked to hang out and party. So based on that, yeah, we partied every night. We went up to the rooftop of the Hotel San Diego, and we would drink up there, because you can't drink in a normal, you know, bar or anything. So we would go upstairs, and I think Olaf was with Steve Olaf and some of his guys. And I don't know if you remember Stan Walk. He was doing Swamp Thing with Alan Moore, you know, in the day, and he was up there. So anybody who really liked to party and do stuff differently, you know, kind of hung out with us.
So am I crazy? I'm obviously, you know, a lot more about comic art than I do, but I still maintain, like, maybe the Stephen Bissett Swamp Thing stuff might be the best illustrated books I've ever seen in my life. It
is. Yeah. And it's perfect for that IP, you know, that idea. He's the perfect artist for it. You know, like I was talking about, like Dan Jurgens, the perfect inker, you know, for the project. That guy was the perfect artist for that book. You know what I mean? Like, it was almost like he was born for that Swamp Thing book.
Because Alan Moore, you know, he doesn't do everything textbook. You know, not everything about Swamp Thing was done with just speech bubbles and everything. There was a lot of introspection. And you just get these amazing pictures of the swamp and the Swamp Thing walking away from you. And you would get the prose on the left side, and there'd be all these little weird details in there. And I'd be like, am I supposed to read this, or am I supposed to take a picture?
Yeah. And he was also the guy that, like, the Swamp Thing would change. Like, he was growing. Like, he wasn't always the same. So, like, the vines and things, sometimes there would be flowers on them, sometimes there wouldn't.
Yes.
Sometimes there'd be vines more, like, you know, outward and, you know, more groomed sometimes. Like, he was different. And I don't really remember if there was a rhyme or reason for it. But I thought it was neat as a reader, because you got the sense that this thing was alive. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't just a guy and covered with vines and stuff. The vines and things were him. Like, the whole thing was alive.
Yeah, absolutely fantastic stuff seeing that. And now, you have worked a lot with Rob Liefeld. He's kind of been in the news lately. What are your thoughts on Rob? You know, obviously he was a Calvin Klein model, wasn't he? Didn't we see him in his
Levi's, like 501 jeans. Yeah.
Marky Mark was Calvin Klein. My bad.
Yeah, take off your shirt. Remember that, the crazy basement? Oh, that stuff was kind of gross. But yeah,
Liefeld doing all the talk shows and all that stuff, and he became a personality unto himself. A lot of people like to crap on his art, and you know, he has his own style. But my goodness, if you want bombastic, awesome, totally 90s out there art, it's Rob Liefeld, isn't it?
Yeah, but I don't think, like, comic books is necessarily high art anyway. You know, it's entertainment, and if you can entertain somebody, if somebody can pick up your book, you know, read it for 20 minutes, half hour, however long, you know, it takes them to get through it, and they enjoy it, more power to you. You know what I mean? Like, if you can pick up a Rob Liefeld book and you can get entertainment out of it, that's the bottom line. So I never say never. You know, you could go technically, you know, maybe his skills aren't as good as, you know, some of these other guys, but that doesn't matter. He still tells a story. It's a unique story. It's, when you pick up a Rob Liefeld book, you know it's Rob Liefeld. You know what I mean? You know what you're getting, and it's a unique experience. So, I mean, how many people can say that? You know what I mean? How many people can say that their style stands out, for right or wrong, stands out that much, that when you see that, you know who drew that?
And it was crazy, at that time, there was a Marvel house style kind of leading up to that. And then the 90s happened. And next thing you know, you got all these different styles being incorporated, and Rob's being one of the most distinguishable. And it drew a lot of people in. He was able to create new characters that right out the bat were popular immediately because they were created by Rob Liefeld. And he had a lot of things out there. And earlier you mentioned there's not a lot of reasons to go out there if you're a great creative person to work for Marvel or DC these days. And I think with what's happened to Rob lately, specifically what Tom Brevoort had to say, what they did to him, kind of bears out that maybe going and do your own thing is the right idea. This is what Brevoort said. In the year or two prior to this, in a misguided and unsuccessful attempt to avoid paying creator incentives to Rob Liefeld, with whom he'd had some bitter encounter, Bill Jemas had decided to relaunch and rebrand the 3 ongoing series that Rob had created participation in, Cable, X-Force, and Deadpool. So Cable became Soldier X, X-Force became X-Statix, and Deadpool became Agent X. All 3 of them suffered failing sales and were ultimately discontinued. That's some pretty shady stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's it going to cost them ultimately? Not that much. I don't understand that. I mean, he contributed, he created this stuff, you made millions of dollars off of it, pay him what he deserves. At this point,
how much have they made off of Cable?
Exactly.
And Deadpool, is Deadpool over $1 billion probably with the movies?
Yeah. Probably, yeah.
I know it was at Fox, but they're
they'll continue. Yeah, they'll continue to make money off of it, and I'm just hoping that they don't eradicate the Cable stuff too much, because I did that run with Fabian, and so a lot of the backstory, Cable's backstory, is there. So there was a lot of characters that we created. So I'm hoping they'll use those. I don't know if there'll be a royalty check or not, but it would be nice to see on the big screen. And also, just to back up for a minute, I haven't got a Marvel royalty in freaking years, so really? I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, I mean, if you think about all the X-Men stuff,
yes, they're basic.
They're reprinting that stuff. All the Ultimate, the Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men, all that stuff should be in high circulation. But I haven't got a royalty. What Marvel does is they had this thing, like, this was the past, but if a book sold 30,000 or more, like at 30,000, royalties started, right? And so what they would do is they would kill, like, they would only print so many of the books, and then they would kind of sell out of it, and then they would do these second printing, but they would do these second printing as like a new number. And so they would repackage it as must-haves or something like that. And so then they would fulfill the need for the book, but also they would change the numbering. So if that must-have book only sold 15 or 20,000, then they didn't have to pay you a royalty off of any of those books or an incentive. So it was a way of, like, instead of like 120,000, let's say that the man was for, they limit it to whatever they think they can get away with. They put those out, and then whatever that demand that they think is there, 20, 30,000 more, they go back to print, but they do it with a different title or whatever it is. So I don't know if you remember the must-haves, and they started doing stuff like that, like shenanigans, where they would do these smaller print runs, and they just wouldn't pay the artist a dime.
Obviously, you got to take this much more personally than I do, but it would feel. The Liefeld thing does feel spiteful, they're going out of their way to deny somebody what they've earned, and obviously given to the industry. But I don't know, like 2 or 3 years, like almost all the superstars that were left at Marvel and DC vacated all at the same time. And when you hear stories like this, and you hear that what you're talking about right there, you can't really blame them. You can't blame Joe Mad for going into video games and not coming back for the most part.
Right. Yeah. It's you're treated better and the money's better. At least, like, because I've done some Hollywood stuff, I've done some advertising work, and it's more of a corporate structure. It's a little bit more, upfront, like what you're doing, how much money. So there aren't really a lot of shady dealings. And if there are, the money's always better. So you're willing to maybe take a little bit of abuse, you know what I mean? Because the money's better. but now I don't understand why. And also a lot of these books, we would always be 3 months in advance. Like we'd had 3 books done. They'd be solicited in Diamond 3 months in advance. So, for the retailers and all that stuff. And when I left DC, the book we were working on was like weeks away from being shipped. You know what I mean? There were no books inventory. There was none of that stuff done. And one, it puts a lot of stress and takes away the fun of working on the books, because everything is like dire. Like you can't miss a deadline. And two, I think the books, they just don't look as good. You know what I mean? Because you're always like working like at breakneck speed. And somebody told me that the reason they do that is because they don't have money to inventory these books anymore. You know what I mean? Because then they would have to invest capital
to create cash. Yeah,
2 other books. So they do this because it's like, we're paying for this, then it pays us back. We're paying for this, pays us back. So you get like a month, a month. Yeah, kind of thing versus like 3 months worth of, investment, which I always think like if you could make money and you were selling books at 10 cents a pop, you know what I mean, in the day, why can't you do it now? 10 cents cents a cover is a hard way to make a living,
I think one of the big mistakes I think Marvel started and DZ kind of went along with is it almost felt like they didn't want superstar artists anymore after what happened with the Image 7. And basically you have your 2 biggest Spider-Man artists and your 3 or 4 biggest X-Men artists all kind of leave at the exact same time, and start their own company or whatever. But I don't think they realize, comic books, well, certainly Batman is very popular and he's worth something. Superman's popular and he's worth something. Spider-Man's popular and he will sell on the name itself, but he will never sell huge without great creative. And if you aren't allowing creatives to make their name and make their legacy and even branch out and make their own opportunities out there, and if you're not paying them appropriately, you're never going to have great creative. And I do think that's one of the things that we're really struggling with at this particular moment is there is just such a lack of quality creative out there because I think so many people have been burned by the big 2 at this point.
I think you're 100% correct because maybe the last 5-6 years that I was working for DC Comics, you wouldn't have a run that was longer than 6 issues. 6-8 issues maybe tops, and then the new creative team would come in. And why they would do that, I have no idea. Other than, like you said, there's 2 ways. Well, there's a way that you could make a name for yourself in this industry, and that's having a good substantial run on a title, right? So if you're there every month, year in, year out, you can establish a following. Because they're buying that book, they're picking up that book, and they see the team that's on it, and they get used to it, and they start they really like it, they really support it, and so sometimes things can be a slow burn. Sometimes it could take 6-8 months, and then all of a sudden they're really on board, and you can build a following. You can build a following.
Chris Claremont's X-Men was still bi-monthly, I believe, when it first came out.
Yeah, you can build a following. You can establish yourself. And you can build yourself a name. But if you don't have that, then no one knows where they can get your work, from month to month. I've had people at conventions, they'd go, "What have you been doing lately?" Like I said, 5-6 years ago, this phenomenon started, and I go, I still do monthly books. I have never stopped. And they're like, "Well, what are you working on?" I'm like, "Hawkman." It's like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? Like they don't pick up Hawkman. And so by the time they get on to Hawkman, like if they talk to me, I'll be off that book and I'll be doing something else. You know what I mean? So it does become a way of like star killer. You can't really build any kind of superstar talent if you can't have a regular place to be every month. It stands to reason. And the only people you saw that were doing regular work, like Capullo, or Jeff Johns or those guys, was because they had to. You know what I mean? You couldn't get away with not, giving Greg Capullo, a monthly title, because he would just walk and go somewhere else.
Yeah. So you were working on the Robert Venditti Hawkman book?
I did the new 52 stuff.
The Jeff Johns?
No,
No.
Rob Liefeld, I think, was writing it. Him and Mark Polton were writing it. Yeah, and I was doing finishes over Joe Bennett.
I love Hawkman, and I love Joe Bennett too.
That stuff was fantastic. That was a great run. I think the writing, because Rob likes big, action, and Joe draws it so well. You know what I mean? Like, it was a great combination. But the thing is, Hawkman isn't a traditionally great selling title.
No.
And also, we inherited it from, it was Philip Tan. I forget who the writer was of the original. And that book was already kind of starting to decline. And once you get to that point, it's really hard to take a book out of a nosedive like that.
So you were right there when all this stuff was happening. We've talked enough about the Image 7 or whatever, and everyone thinks about Wildstorm and Top Cow and Extreme and all these things, and obviously the McFarlane imprint and all that stuff. But before that, for a while, did you work in Homage Studios, or were you just sitting there with them, or Homage Studios?
Okay, Homage was in the X-Men days. I think it did cross over a little bit into the Image stuff. But there was Hack Shack Studios, which was my studio, and we always worked with Jim, Whilce, and Scott. So it's like the four of us were like the X team. And so I remember I was like, I'm going to have a studio name. So I had, this was the day of faxes, right? So I put a fax letterhead together and said Hack Shack Studios, and I sent it over to, it wasn't Homage, it was just those three guys, right? And so then I got a reply back, and Whilce had done a logo, and it said Homage Studios. And so it was just kind of like two guys, just, two teams of people just calling their apartment, a studio.
That's what the TMNT guys did with Mirage.
Yeah. And so then that's kind of like the early Homage Studios. And there were three guys that were renting an apartment. I was working out of an apartment at Huntington Beach. No, it was Hermosa Beach. And so then they just kind of grew, you know what I mean? So Homage, grew into, when they went to, Image started. So then Homage was that kind of studio name. And then they started hiring more people out. And then I don't know why it went from Homage to Wildstorm, but then it went to Wildstorm. But I think most of the stuff I did with them was Homage, when I worked with those guys.
So Scott Williams is another obviously well-known inker. Is he like a mentor, or is he just a colleague or a peer?
Colleague, peer. I think I started
established.
Yeah, I started, I think, before him. So I got.
Did you have a perfect mentor, or somebody that really helped you out, like getting into the inking game and understanding responsibilities and how everything worked?
I kind of wish, because
you had to wing it.
Well, the West Coast there was really no comic book people. You know what I mean? So I think the reason, like, Homage and Extreme Studios and Top Cow, all that stuff is all West Coast. Silvestri, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, Whilce Portacio, myself. It's all West Coast stuff. And later, I mean, that decade was kind of known as the West Coast look. So that style of working all came from basically the four of us, Whilce, Rob, or not Rob, but Jim, Scott, and myself. And so I think of Scott and I as like we were teammates. Trying to get those books done, because I mean the schedules were so bad. So if Scott couldn't do a page, I did a page, and most of the time I filled the gap for Scott. Scott was a little slower, working than I was. So a lot of the stuff was uncredited. So I would do a page for Scott or whatever. And also I had assistants. So I had like Danny Mickey was one of my assistants, and
Very
Trevor
nice.
Scott. And both of those guys were first hires. So Homage hired Trevor, and then Extreme Studios hired Danny. And so we were doing backgrounds for Scott as well. So there was a lot of just jamming, just getting books done. So if something needed to happen, we made it happen, right? So one of the things we didn't want to do is to just let anything outside of the four of us happen. You know what I mean? We didn't want to bring in anybody else. So it was pretty much just the four of us, because we all got it. We all got the look. We all got the style of everything. And
once you got the system down.
Yeah.
Including new things just breaks up the whole system.
Yeah, it still ended up, it still ended up happening at times, but we tried to do everything in our power to make sure it didn't happen. Yeah.
So you've mentioned Whilce Portacio a lot. I live here in the Philippines. I've been here for well over 6 years now, living here with my wife and kids. And Whilce Portacio is like the guy. You know, he is the guy that's on the Mount Rushmore of Filipino comic book personalities. He's number one. Always seems like a really humble, down-to-earth kind of guy. Fantastic artist. Should have been the Image 8, but obviously something happened. I believe he had a family emergency. He wasn't able to go with those guys and all that stuff. But what were your thoughts of Whilce?
Well, one thing early on, I had 2 books that I was slated to do when I left Marvel. So I was supposed to ink Silvestri's Cyberforce. That was my book. I could always do 2 books a month. And then I was going to ink Whilce's WetWorks. Yes. So those are the 2 books, the first year of Image Comics. And obviously, you know, Mark did 1 book for the entire year and Whilce didn't get his done. So doing black and white and working at Extreme Studios was probably the best, you know, plan B that I had at that time. Whilce is kind of the creative push of all that stuff. Like I don't think he got as much credit as he deserves. So a lot of that uplighting, a lot of that hatching, a lot of those ideas, those character designs and stuff, that was Whilce. Like Jim did a lot too, but Whilce, especially early on, did a bunch of that stuff. And I remember, you know, like Whilce and I just hanging out, and he'd say, this is kind of like the ideas behind this inking. So he'd give me parameters, and I would work within those parameters and then kind of riff off that and give him, you know, stuff beyond that and so on and so forth. And the one thing about, like, I've noticed about like Filipinos and stuff, is they're very family oriented. So once you kind of connect with them, then they treat you like family. So I love that, like Whilce and Whilce's wife and just all the different like Filipino people, even people that know Whilce, like Filipino people, just because they know that I'm in good with Whilce, I'm in good with them too. Like I was at a convention, I forget where, and God, I forget who the guys were, but they were there with their family, and they were like, "You're going out to dinner with us," and I'm like, "I am?" And they go, "Yeah, you are." So they just kind of kidnapped me from the con and then took me out. So it was great. So love those people, love Whilce, and eventually Whilce from San Diego ended up moving out to Corona, and so he and I were like, I don't know, a few miles from each other.
Neighbors?
Yeah, we were neighbors. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems pretty. That's a pretty cool story. Yeah, he's super duper popular. Every year whenever they do cons here, he's got to be like the big guest of honor. But it sucks because there was a long time within Filipino culture before I got here where like there was a tradition where the men in the neighborhood would go and they would buy all the new comic books that week, and they would go back to their neighborhood and they would lay them all out. And the kids would all come out and they would read them every week and all that stuff. But they've literally gotten so expensive, and there's no distribution in Asia, so everything's even more expensive here than it would be in America, that kids don't even read American comic books anymore, where it would have been an enormous part of a lot of Filipino, because there's a lot of artists out there. That's where they would have got their inspiration.
Is it translated, or are they reading it in English?
I imagine it was in English.
Oh, okay.
Things are a little bit different now with the advent of YouTube, so Philippines is a little bit different. The national language is Tagalog, but they really only speak that on one island. And then every other island, because the Philippines was very tribal, has like their own unique language. And then everyone also, for the most part, learns English in school, but a lot of the kids watch a lot of YouTube now. So a lot of the kids speak English better than they do Tagalog at this point.
That's funny. Yeah.
So it's kind of weird. So
Yeah,
I think it was probably all in English, because there's always been that. Well, there hasn't always been, but for a very long time, there was that American presence because of it was a U.S. territory until after like World War II, but we still maintain bases and stuff here. So pretty interesting stuff. Another thing Homage did, were you a part of Heroes Reborn?
I did Heroes Return at Marvel, but I did not work on Heroes Reborn.
Which was the big idea where they wanted to, I guess, to recapture the Marvel Knights thing, where they take some fledgling franchises, basically ship them out and subcontract them, thinking that obviously Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld, who had been enormously popular on X-Men, might be able to save Captain America and the Avengers and stuff like that. Yeah. Initially, the sales were good, but it didn't really work, huh?
No. I think the product, the writing, it was kind of lacking in a lot of ways. Consistency, there wasn't the same talent on all the books, and so I just think it kind of fell apart, and the readers understood that. I still think that Marvel, if they could, they would license the entire Marvel universe out to somebody, because if they could get rid of that overhead, I think they would in a heartbeat.
But you were a part of Heroes Return, so by that point you had gone back to Marvel, or were you still working at Marvel?
Yeah, I was back. I was back at Marvel. This was probably 96, 97. So the market started shifting, changing, and I wanted to do, so I did Black and White in 94. That was a miniseries I did at Image. And so then I took about 8 months off to try to inventory for an ongoing. So I inventoried a lot of Black and White stories and was going to launch those the following year. So in that year span, sales plummeted. Like every month, man, it was amazing how much the sales was going down. So I had talked with a lot of my industry friends, and they said, it's probably going to be safe by the time you launch this. Everything will be stable and whatever. And so by the time I got there, it had almost rock bottomed. Yeah, so we put out that first issue of the ongoing Black and White. It was called Codename Black and White. And the sales came back, and the sales were like, our profit, I think, was like $70K or something like that. It was pretty decent, but with the expenses and the cost of everything, because it all came out of that profit, there was a little bit of money in our pocket, but not much. So by the time we put out issue 2, issue 3, we would have been, shelling out money to make this book happen. So that independent spirit, all that stuff,
wasn't the right time. You missed it.
It was
the one time you missed it.
well, Black and White, the 3-issue miniseries. Oh my gosh! Like we did really well, Wes. We did really, really well. And so then I went. We just had our daughter, our only kid, actually. So I needed stability, to raise her, and so I went back to Marvel from Image, because those guys, it was clear, man. Things were shifting, things were changing daily, and it didn't look like Extreme Studios was going to stay open very much longer. So I left Extreme. I left with Jeff Matsuda and Chap Yape and a couple other guys from Extreme, and so we opened our own studio. Also, the Color House that was later. Not Hi-Fi, I forget what they were called now, but the Extreme Color House came over with us as well. So we had like a little studio. It was like 3 offices and like a kind of dinette area, and so we worked there. So a lot of the Heroes Reborn stuff was done there, and so we got a lot of, like, the Extreme guys would come over and hang out with us, and they were just like, so Extreme's going down. Like, what do we do? What do we do? Because we were already going into the mainstream. I was going back, but Jeff was starting his career in the mainstream, and so was the Color House and all that other stuff. So yeah, it was really kind of horrible times. But the money at Marvel was still pretty good, though. I mean, the X books were still doing okay in comparison.
But Marvel wasn't doing great, and they wouldn't be doing great for a while. But you were a part of the big rebound because you were there for Ultimate Spider-Man, which is basically when Joe Quesada comes on board, brings in some creative talent they probably never would have used at Marvel before then, and starts trying, or I guess you're rolling the dice on some Mark Millers or some Brian Michael Bendis's, and eventually you get your Rick Remenders and Jonathan Hickman's all come in, and Ultimate Spider-Man is enormous. They're redoing it right now.
Yeah, the thing is, I think the experiment was pretty. They got like indie guys and merged them with like mainstay Marvel guys. Like what kind of like contributors to like the Marvel look, or at least the Marvel, universe in a substantial way. So it was like Adam Kubert, it was Mark Bagley, and then there was me. I inked both those books. And so then they got like indie guys, like you said, you got, your Mark, and you got your Brian Bendis and stuff like that. And it was a crapshoot, but man, did it pay off. And I remember talking to Mark Bagley about it because I think Byrne had just done that year one of Spider-Man, and it crashed and burned like just before, Ultimate Spider-Man. And so Mark and I were like, 3-4 issues tops. This book's going to get canceled. This book's going to get canceled. So we were always expecting like just this thing just to go, belly up. And the thing is, every month it started building, it kept building. And yeah, it was Marvel's cash cow for a long time. So was that X book. Yeah.
So Mark Bagley, I mean, you might not have realized it or thought at the time, but he would go on and probably illustrate more Spider-Man comic books than anybody. Is he just like the fastest great artist ever or something?
Yeah, he's really fast. He's got a style that he hits this level, kind of like Dan Jurgens. There's always this professional level, right, that they hit. It never really goes beyond that, and it never goes below that. So I always think like Bagley's kind of like Jurgens, where if you have an inker that has a strong look and identity, you can make Bagley look great, and I think over a period of time I kind of started dictating a look on those books, and I think it started looking more contemporary, a little slicker, a little more interesting, and it was a blast because I never had to worry about work, you know what I mean? Because at one point we went bi-monthly or something like that. We were putting out like 2 books a month. It was crazy.
Absolutely. And he could actually keep up with it.
Yeah. And so did I. And we didn't miss a single issue. I think for never 2 or 3 years, like we did every line in that book, every drawing, everything that was there was done by us. And I do remember early on, the goal was to beat Kirby's record on FF.
Did you realize at the time that Bendis was going to be the guy at Marvel Comics for the next, 10, 15 years?
No, I was a little cynical going into it because the only reason he was able to write Spider-Man the way he did is because Spider-Man was an established character. I have friends that are writers, and they said, because it took so long for him to even get into costume, it was almost like that TV show 48 Hours.
8 issues, yes.
Yeah, like it was definitely like a slow progression. So every idea he was able to really get in depth with, and you really couldn't write a comic book like that before, right? Because you had to sell that book based on its own merits. So you usually had to get something in there that would attract a reader. But with this, it kind of went against convention. So it took its time to evolve. And by doing that, you really felt compelled. You know what I mean? Like it felt like a day in the life. You really felt like you knew these guys and stuff like that. So it was a big gamble, but you couldn't have done that with a new IP. You could only do that with an IP that was established because you already know Peter Parker is going to become Spider-Man, right? So you have patience to read the, you know what I mean? Like you said, 8 issues or whatever until he gets the costume on. Where if it was a brand new IP, you'd have to get him in that suit the first issue. You know what I mean? So I think Bendis was kind of the right idea with the right IP. You know what I mean? Like Marvel was behind him. He had the right idea. And it was the right IP that you could reinvent it that way in a very slow, methodic way. And it paid off big time.
Well, I think over time it ended up backfiring on him because he kind of went with the same concept a little bit too often. But he was the guy for a long time.
Well, I have a theory why it backfired. And I told those guys at the beginning, because one of the things they were saying is like, well, we want to start with a new number 1. You know, like this is not going to be your father's Spider-Man because of all this backlog of stories and all this stuff. And I don't know when this comic industry, and I don't know if you agree with me, Wes, but I don't know when the industry decided that all this backstory, all these old comic books were a burden for readers.
Like an anchor?
Well, no, just for like a burden for the reader, because
Yes.
then they're like, the reader doesn't know anything. You're just throwing them in the middle of a story or whatever. Hey, I grew up like that. And you know what? All it would take is an editorial note to go, hey, if you want to see more, go buy this book. And you know what I did? I went and bought that damn book. You know what I mean? Like it always works. So instead of just having that one book, now all of a sudden you can go back, you can read backstory, you can find other adventures. And then you had the monthly stuff that was happening at that moment happening as well. So one of the things they were saying as a selling point with the Ultimates is like, it's starting off with a new number 1. So we're going to attract a whole new audience, right? And then I said, okay, what happens in 10 years? The same thing. It's a never-ending cycle. Eventually, you are going to have the same problem that you said that you were going to try to resolve. It will always end that way. There will always be story baggage. That's just the way it is. But if you frame it up as a negative, like it seems like they were, then it becomes a negative. I choose to see it as like, well, it's more opportunity to sell back issues. And you remember in the day, like if a retailer could sell back issues, that was a good sign that that book was strong. Like if Spider-Man was selling, but the back issues were selling as well, then you knew there was a demand for it.
One Piece has been going on for I mean, we're well over 1,000 chapters. It's been going on for over 20 years. And there are still new readers coming in on One Piece, even though they know they have 20 years of story they have to read to get to the end. It's not an impediment. It lets you know that it's so good it never stopped because there was always demand for it. But
there's always new stories. And there's always new stories. You had to wait a month for the next adventure of Spider-Man, right? But you could go to, a comic shop and you could get back issues. And that's another thing that I think why comic shops started hurting is because I think the back issue market started dying. So they were just selling monthly floppies, and they were basically just becoming 7-Elevens. At that point, and the cool aspect of buying back issues was kind of going away.
So you also had participation in another weird project, or I find it interesting. I don't know if I want to say weird. There was a time when Kevin Smith was the king of nerd. We had Clerks going out there. He had Mallrats, all that kind of stuff, and he was dabbling in. He certainly is a comic book fan. He's got an awesome story about trying to make a Superman movie when he was on the lecture circuit or whatever. And he did some stuff with Daredevil. We're still waiting for the end of his Daredevil Bullseye story. I don't think we'll ever get that one. We're also still waiting on a sequel to Batman Widening Gear called Batman Bellicosity. We were supposed to get it in 2014. It's been 10 years overdue. And you were part of the creative process on that book?
I think, yeah. It was supposed to be a series. It was supposed to come out monthly, and then for some reason it got chopped in half. So it was 6 issues, and then it was going to be another 6 issues, something like that, right? So I have 3 issues that have never seen the light of day in that room right there that are completely done. artwork and everything. So I don't know what DC's
So the production
doing with
was
it.
on it. It's been paid for at least halfway.
Yeah, so I don't know if Kevin Smith just bowed out and didn't do the last 3 issues, or I don't really know whatever happened with that. And also editorially, I think there was a lot of movement, like a lot of different editors on the books and stuff like that. So
Initially, it was supposed to be in continuity, but by the time production was done, it was clear that it couldn't be, I think, in continuity.
yeah, it was a mess from the very beginning. It was a cluster F from the beginning. And I do think there are people that kind of operate in chaos, but I think it does well for them, but it doesn't do well for people surrounding them. I think Kevin Smith is one of those guys. Like, there's just chaos happening.
He's all right with it, but nobody else can keep up.
Right, because it always benefits him somehow, but it doesn't benefit the people that are around him. So if you get in bed with Kevin Smith, most likely you're going to get burned at some point.
He's gonna finish the project.
And the only reason I did the book to begin with is it was as a favor to Dan DiDio. So Dan was the original editor on it, and he said he needed me to come in because of my skill set, finishes, making things professional, to work with a amateur penciler. And bring it up to standards. So I had never done samples before. I mean, early on, they would ask me, and I'd say, "You know what I can do. I'm not going to, either you hire me
to
or
audition."
Yeah, they wanted me to audition, and so I said, "I don't do this." And I was talking to Dan, and Dan said, "We'll pay you this much money." And I said, "Okay."
You got a deal.
So I did some killer samples. I sent them in. I got the okay, and then I can't remember. Walter Flanagan, I think, was the penciler on it, and he was one of Kevin's buddies, and I think he was one of those comic shop. What was that show? That reality show that they had. It was there. It was like it was Kevin Smith's comic shop, and Walter ran it for him, and it was some kind of reality show. But anyways, Walter was kind of a reality star, but not really a comic book artist. And so I came in there and I did what I was hired to do. And then eventually, I think their egos, and maybe it was Walter's ego, got involved and was like, I get a email from Kevin, and Kevin says, "You're burying Walter. I can't see Walter in the work anymore. I need you to pull back." And I said, "This is what I was hired to do. This is what they okayed. You okayed. You signed off. DC okayed, signed off." And he said, "I don't care about that." He said, "I don't think what you're doing is right." Like somehow it was personal, right? So then I
hired your friend that's not a professional artist to illustrate the book.
Dude,
are you sure you were right, sir?
Oh man, you brought up sir. The relationship between Kevin and I started dwindling down, because you know how like when you move to like the South or like Texas, when they say sir, they mean it as it's respectful, right? But in California and certain Hollywood people, when they call you sir, it's derogatory, right? So then all my emails after that from Kevin would be like, "I asked you to do this, sir. Sir, this was our agreement, sir." You know what I mean? So it was all kind of like, sir, that kind of thing. And so eventually I just started inking, just covering lines. You know what I mean? I wasn't even trying anymore. And I contacted Dan. He wasn't editor on the book anymore, but I contacted him because my agreement was with Dan. And I said, "Dan," "I can't take," because they gave me a crazy page rate. It was absurd amount of money. And so I said, "I can't accept this page rate anymore because I'm not doing the work." You know what I mean? I'm basically just inking as is. And then he said, "I know this is a cluster F." He said, just take the money.
You earned it with all the sirs. Those were not meant.
He said, just
to put you in high regard, sir.
Yeah, just take the money, sir. And then this was the final straw. Is Kevin said he said, you're selling the artwork, right? I said, yeah. He said, I want to sell your artwork. I want to sell it all together. And I said, well, I don't really want to do that. I'll sell my own artwork. He said, I tell you what, sir, we'll do the San Diego con together. We'll do a big push. We'll bring all the artwork there, and then we'll sell it. And he said, I can probably get more money for the pages than you could anyway, sir. And so I went, fine. And so we had this big old dog and pony. We had like a signing at the DC table or the booth. And then we had like a dog and pony where we had, what are those, like Q&A kind of things and stuff like that. And it became quickly apparent that none of this stuff was going to happen. No, people cared, but they cared about him, not necessarily the project. You know what I mean? Yeah. It was more, yeah. And so then there was we didn't sell one page of artwork, nothing. Yeah, it was just a cluster F. Yeah. And
thus why you're on your own now. And now you've mentioned Black and White. It started out as an ongoing series, and I think Extreme, you said, unfortunately didn't get off to the start that you wanted. Then you had a mini series, and you've relaunched, and you are in Black and White because you're doing your own thing now, right?
Yeah. Actually, this indie market is very, very strong. There's a great fan base that supports these books, and so I've never experienced anything like this in 40 years, where we're taking these projects, these books that we're working on, and these are heartfelt. These are our babies, and that we're able to bring them right to the readers, right to the consumer. There's no middleman. There's no nothing. So we do our YouTube channels. We talk directly to people. We hold up our books and we say, hey, this is what I'm working on right now. So if you like good comic books and you like, what I do, then support me. And so far it's worked. I'm 5 years into this now. Oh my gosh, 5 years into creating my own IP. So I got Chrono Mechanics, they're time repairmen. I got Black and White. So, they're kind of like vigilante spies and, in the sci-fi kind of universe. And so I'm just having the time of my life doing things I've always wanted to do. I always had like a very independent spirit. I started off in independence, like deep independence, almost underground independence with Jim Valentino and Renegade Press and, Aardvark Vanheim and all that stuff. So, but it didn't pay. So the main reason I went to Marvel and DC is because I needed a steady paycheck. I loved those characters as a kid, but I didn't have a real, affection towards them as an adult. I wanted to create my own stuff. So always looking for opportunities in the 40 years to do it. So Image Comics, that was a viable place to create independent properties. And now, this independent boom that's happening with Indiegogo, crowdfunding, Kickstarter, these type of platforms, it becomes very, very viable for people like me to go in there and run campaigns and create comic books for consumers.
Speaking of Black and White, you are actually in the fulfillment process right now. But if people didn't realize the project was out there, they're on the fence, they still have a little bit more time because you do have the in-demand store on Indiegogo for this version of Black and White.
Yeah, so we're going to be closing in the next couple of weeks. So right now, Black and White, Man vs. Machine, Volume 2 is available on in-demand on Indiegogo. So maybe 3 weeks tops. And also, you guys, keep in mind, like if you back anything, any of the tiers, you're still going to get all the stretch goals. So we didn't pull the stretch goals. So all the extra goodies, go through the list. It's still up there, and find out all the cool stuff you're going to get: patches, pins, stickers, trading cards, all kinds of cool stuff. So it's a great campaign. I love where I'm at right now, Wes. I mean, getting feedback directly. I mean, we used to remember the Marvel, they used to have the letter column, and maybe there would be one or two, letters that were addressed to you. But now everything's direct feedback, good, bad, indifferent, direct feedback. And I want to show you this. This just touched me. I actually got a handwritten thank you card for Black and White, Man versus Machine. So it was
Is
very
that from
sweet.
Eric O'Sullivan? Because that seems like an Eric O'Sullivan move.
It does it. I think it's her name's Susan. I'm not going to say the last name because I don't want to dox anybody, but
you'll probably
Susan.
get one from Eric too. He loves creator-owned books.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I get them back because you can communicate through Indiegogo, so I get the direct feedback through the updates and stuff like that. But it's fantastic. This new technology is really enabling creators to do their own thing. I don't have to listen to an editor. I don't have to compromise, things I want to do stylistically, artistically, any of those things. So it's freedom. It's complete and utter freedom, and I'm enjoying every day.
And this is not the end of Black and White. As you can imagine, it was very successful with Volume 1, Volume 2 very successful. But you are expanding the Black and White family. I've been excited to mention this because I've been sworn to secrecy, but you've told me we can mention that a member of the Thinking Critical family is teaming up with the Art Thibert family. Aaron Sparrow is on board to edit?
He's writing. He's my co-writer.
Wow.
So my wife
Even
usually
more creative.
Yeah, my wife usually edits, so it'll be. I wonder how Aaron's going to deal with that, but
she's going to give him a ton of red ink. Like, you don't know what you're doing, son.
What are you doing? That's not how you spell that word. But my wife's got plenty of experience too. She wrote policies and procedures for aerospace. So you don't mess around with policies and procedures for aerospace. So so Aaron's on board. I got the overview yesterday. I was really, really busy yesterday, so I didn't get to read it. And this morning, I just got the first 5 pages of actual script. So as soon as we're done here, I got the pleasure of reading some Aaron Sparrow stuff. Yeah. I tell you, there's a few people in my life that I've encountered creatively that just kind of get me and the creative process, and just brainstorming with Aaron, it just clicked right off the bat. It was almost like if I said something, he could complete the sentence. So these are the people you want to write with, and he gets the sensibility, because the sensibility, it's kind of like comics of old. Like it's kind of, the sensibility isn't to be taken completely serious. So I'm a big fan of Big Trouble Little China. So it's kind of like on that level, but not quite to that extreme. So somewhere, like played down a little bit, but definitely a lot of one-liners, fun, but it's all through the character. You know what I mean? Like, it's not just like, here's a joke for joke's sake. It all comes out of character, all comes out of situation. Like Big Trouble Little China. That thing's filled with a bunch of cool one-liners. I love that show.
I'm glad Aaron's working out for you, because in my experience, Aaron is a total diva. I've called him the Kevin Smith of Thinking Critical YouTube. Always called me sir, just being snide.
Yeah, well, he's definitely got that side, but you know what?
I'm teasing. He's awesome.
I send him treats. He loves Hostess snacks, so I just send him care packages. Yeah,
some ding dongs, and he's all good.
Yeah, ho-hos and ding dongs.
Very nice. So that's super duper exciting. Congratulations to you and Aaron. Cannot wait for Black and White Volume 3. But in the meantime, you've got another project coming out, Oodles and Doodles and other stuff too. I imagine it's an art book. Are we going to get the Walt Flanagan pages in this thing?
No, sadly, no Walt Flanagan. And if I had my way, I would probably, they would never see the light of day, because it's not some of my best. Early on, I tried, but they just beat me up so bad. So yeah, this is we did this very limited. I think there were 500 in the print run, so they were signed and numbered. We completely sold out of these through Kickstarter. Awesome. So I've noticed that there's a demand. People have been asking me. They couldn't get it. I think on eBay, this book is going for $100 now. So we won't be charging $100, but it's got a lot of my DC Marvel stuff in there. There's some pinups, there's commissions, there's a behind the scenes working drawings. There's working drawings here. So it's a fantastic coffee table book. What I'd like to do crowdfunding this time is I'd like to do a second printing cover, like do a new cover. and then add some pages to this so we can build it through the new campaign. So it will be the same book, but kind of like a new edition of the same book. I guess like a volume 2 idea. Nice. And so that's what we're going to be doing as soon as we get done fulfilling Black and White, which should be, by the end of this coming month. So look forward to Oodles of Doodles and other stuff too. My art book, which will have, I don't know, over 40 years worth of, well, not over 40 years, about 40 years worth of drawings in there.
Well, congratulations on all the success. I'm very happy that you were able to find your way out of the mainstream and do your own thing. Because I can tell you, as somebody that worked in the government for over 20 years, I'm retired Air Force, and now I've got a YouTube channel. There's nothing better than being your own boss and getting to do the stuff that you want to do rather than the stuff that you're told you have to do.
Yeah, it's freedom. It really does feel like freedom. I have enough self-discipline, doing this for all those years. I think some people that didn't have that might be lost working for themselves with this kind of freedom. Like freedom comes responsibility. So you have to be able to get up, prepare, like for you, prepare for the show. I don't know, clean the room behind you. That room
definitely.
Always,
my wife does all that. I'm terrible.
It's complete. It's always
those
clean.
Pillows better be better, honey. Better get them in
They're
order.
stacked perfectly. Yeah.
She's got different pillows for different seasons and holidays. That is
seriously? Wow,
yes.
That's cool.
She takes it very seriously. I don't get it.
So do you have different seasons in the Philippines, or is it always the same?
When it gets down to about 80 degrees or maybe 78 degrees, my wife thinks that we are in Alaska. She wants a hoodie. It's cold weather. So,
yeah, it's cold.
To me, as somebody that's kind of lived all over the world, it feels like it's just kind of shorts weather 24/7, 365. But to the natives, they tell a difference.
They're like, "Brr, it's getting cold in here." So do you even have a heater in that house? It's probably all air conditioning, right?
Not even in my car. The cars don't even come with the heater option. It just comes with AC.
Yeah, I would imagine.
There's no heater. We don't even really have hot water. Like there's not like a hot water boiler in the house. Like so it's always using those little kettles and stuff.
Oh, really? So does it come out? Because I noticed like in the summertime here in Texas, the water will come out of the tap warmer.
For basically room temperature, a little bit warmer than that, yeah.
Yeah.
So a little oddities here.
Indeed, yeah.
So I do want to say thank you very much. You are a scholar and a gentleman, sir, and I mean that with the highest respect and not trying to be provocative or anything like that. Art and I literally just met, 30 minutes before this started, and it feels like I've been talking to an old friend, and I do appreciate it, talking about all the geek stuff and the evolution of comic books and your enormous place in it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was great. It's easy to talk to you. Fan of the show, Thinking Critical is, if you guys don't know, subscribe to that channel. It's fantastic. You are one of the guys that's still honest. You haven't been beat up yet. You're honest. Your takes on these books and what's happening in the industry right now are absolutely A1 fantastic.
Thank you very much, sir. Till we meet again.